Hi everyone, welcome to Lola's Frugal Life. This is episode number 275. Today we're going to be talking about creating an emergency budget. So please stick around for a few quick words from our sponsor and we'll get right into the show. So today I wanted to talk about creating an emergency budget. So there might be a better name for this, but I refer to it as an emergency budget. It's basically a version of your budget that would be used in case of an emergency. So it's pretty much like a completely stripped down version of your budget that only has the necessities included. Like all non-essential costs would be taken out of this version of your budget. It's pretty much what you would rely on to determine what your basic needs are and what your only the essential bills that you have to pay are, so that if you were in an emergency situation, you would have a budget to fall back on and not have to, you'd kind of already know like what costs at minimum do you have to cover each week or month or whatever period you're looking at. So there's kind of two main reasons that I can think of why it's important to have an emergency budget. The first one is to generally just to have one so that you can determine how much money you'd want to save in your emergency fund. So usually most experts say you should save approximately 3 to 6 months worth of expenses in your emergency fund. But in order to determine that amount, you need to determine what your monthly expenses are so that you can know how much 3 to 6 months of expenses represents. So that's where you want to create an emergency budget, because when you're saving up an emergency fund, you really want to zero in on what your essential expenses are and save that much months of expenses. You wouldn't be including in that saving money for like dining out at a nice restaurant or something like that, because you're in an emergency situation if you're tapping into that money, if you're relying on the emergency fund to get by. So you would want to calculate that amount based on a really scaled down budget. Another reason to have an emergency budget, and in addition to just that initial determining how much you want to put in your emergency fund, is really for peace of mind. It feels good to know that you have a plan in place if something were to happen where you would need to cut your expenses to a bare minimum. You don't want to have to go through the stress of working through your budget while you're already going through whatever your emergency situation is. So by taking your time and going through the details of your budget when you're not in the midst of a stressful situation, you can definitely make better decisions. And if the time were to come when you really needed to cut back, you would have a resource to go to so that you could get started on making whatever changes need to be made, rather than being in the middle of that stressful situation and then having to sit there sorting through your budget trying to figure out where you can cut. Another thing to think about when you're creating this emergency budget is to maybe consider listing out what you are cutting from the budget, like in words, kind of like in a list format, so that it's not just you have this version of your regular budget and this version of your emergency budget, but something to kind of quantify what has been taken out. Just because it's a lot easier to just look at a list if you need to start making cuts. It's something you can reference so that you can start pulling back on expenses right away if the need were to come up. So for example, the list might say, call to cancel a satellite radio subscription, buy ground coffee to start making coffee at home, change cell phone plan if lower option is available, cancel streaming services, whatever the things are that you've pulled out of your budget and that you would want to start cutting right away. Just kind of creating a list of those items can be helpful. The ones I said, of course, are just like some general examples that people usually talk about cutting when they're trying to save money. But the whole point is just to kind of have a list that you could just quickly refer to and say, oh, right, I should start cutting out these expenses because, we're having this situation happen right now, rather than having to sit there and compare both versions of your budget and try and figure out what the differences were. And especially considering that some time has probably passed since you created that budget, the emergency version, it's going to be much more time consuming for you to try and figure out what items you had cut out of that budget were. So just having kind of a consolidated list of those areas that you want to go to right away to cut can be really helpful. I'd like to take a moment to talk about the sponsor of today's podcast, Ana Luisa. That's ANALUISA. I recently got 2 new pairs of earrings from Ana Luisa that I really love. One of my favorites is the Celeste Huggy Hoop earrings. They're a really cute pair of mismatched earrings. One of them's a moon and one of them's a star. And I really loved them when I saw them online, but when they arrived, I found that they were even prettier in person. Ana Luisa creates high-quality jewelry pieces at very affordable prices. Their packaging and products are carbon neutral, so they have no negative impact on the environment. I was surprised by how unique and elegant their jewelry was, while being really fun at the same time. They have jewelry starting at prices as low as $39. So if you're looking to treat yourself, a friend, or family member, be sure to check out their jewelry at shop.analuisa.com/Lola. That's shop.analuisa.com/Lola. Get yourself or your loved ones the perfect gift with up to 40% off by using my link, which can be found in the show notes. So when you're working on your emergency budget, you might initially think that you're only going to be looking to cut expenses and not add any expenses. But you might want to consider what additional costs might come up during an emergency, because then that will help you really dig further to see what else maybe you could cut to help cover any extra expenses that might happen as a result of whatever situation you're going through. So you don't want to just say, okay, these are all the things I can cut, and then think you're in good shape, because maybe there's some other expenses that might happen because of the situation. So you really want to dig deeper and see everything you can really cut, considering that other expenses might happen at that time. For example, say if you're out of work for a medical emergency and you're limited on leaving the house or limited in how much you can cook, you might wind up incurring extra costs for having to order some takeout food, or maybe you need to have groceries delivered and that might have some additional fees associated with it. Or maybe you're going to be doing a lot of travel to a doctor or physical therapy or something like that, and you might need to have extra money for gas. So of course there's no way to determine what additional costs may come as a result of your emergency, because obviously you don't know what that emergency is going to be. But just considering that there might be some additional costs that happen related to the situation, it'll kind of help you focus on really getting everything out that is non-essential, so that you have a little bit of extra wiggle room in there if you do have some extra expenses that happen at that time. So you might be thinking, if you are already living on a really scaled back budget, that there's nothing more you can cut. So the thing is that if you're barely getting by with your current income and you've already cut everything out of your budget, you may need to consider how to bring in some additional income. That might mean bringing in some income even just for a short period of time, maybe doing a side job or taking on some overtime, so that you can save up an emergency fund that will cover you for a longer period of time, because you might not really even be able to cut back on your expenses. And you might also want to consider if there is something you could do to boost your income for the longer term if you are living on a budget that is so extremely tight that you feel like you have no room to make any adjustments to that budget. It can be really stressful to know that if an emergency comes up, you don't really have any options for cutting back. So if you can try and maybe consider the ways you might be able to boost your regular income so that you have a little more wiggle room in your budget, that might not necessarily be a quick fix, but it might take some time and planning. But there's usually ways to increase your income over time, even if you have to kind of work at it for a while. But it definitely can be difficult to deal with an emergency situation if you are on such a super tight budget. So some things you might want to look at when you're looking at your budget to see what you would cut to create this emergency version of it. I think groceries are kind of usually the first place most of us go when we need to reduce our budget, but that is a good place to look, because a lot of times there's a lot of flexibility in groceries, maybe switching from name brands to the store brand, or maybe going with some less expensive types of food. You can cut back on expensive meats and maybe go for more chicken breast versus ground beef or steak. You can use less meat in each meal. This works well with things like soup or sauce or whatever, where the meat isn't really the main dish, so you can put a little bit less and still kind of get the same impact of that ingredient. Another thing to kind of look at is how much do you spend on disposable products. So this might not seem significant, but continuously stocking up on paper towels, paper plates, plastic utensils, plastic cups, all that kind of stuff can be really costly. And especially if you have kids that kind of blow through those things like crazy, while that might be convenient in your regular life, it's something to consider cutting when you really need to pull back on expenses. And then, of course, maybe you're paying for extra internet speed or unlimited data on your phone. Again, these are definitely nice to have as a convenience, but if they're not really necessary, you might be able to find some savings here. Even if you don't cut your service, you could always try calling to see what offers are available. So I've actually saved money just by checking the current offerings on data plans for my cell phone and then being able to switch to whatever they were currently offering, which happens to be better than what I was paying. They're obviously not going to call you and tell you there's a better deal available. So checking into any of those things, especially if you're in an emergency situation and you haven't checked into them, it might be a good time to take a look. Or even when you're doing that emergency budget, just kind of as a reminder to go check and see where you might be able to save some money just in the regular course of life. Those are things that you might be able to cut back on now so that you don't even have to worry about them in the future. And then, of course, things like vacation savings, gym memberships, expensive wine, streaming services, anything that you might have in your budget that is not a necessity should be considered to see if you can cut those out. Because remember, this is only to get through a rough time. It's a budget that you would be able to live on if you were in a bad financial situation, either through loss of income or maybe you had a major medical bill or whatever the situation may be where you need to rely on that emergency fund and you want to cut your expenses down to the smallest amount possible. So, as I mentioned earlier, knowing that you have a plan in place for an emergency fund can help you feel more at ease in your everyday living, because it just kind of feels good to know, like, if something were to happen, at least I have something to fall back on and I'm not going to be scrambling trying to figure out what I need to do. And it's also just a good exercise to go through and really take a look at what you're spending money on. And you can also use this as a tool if you need to cut back expenses for a shorter period of time. Like maybe you're trying to get out of debt or build up an emergency fund, or maybe you just want to save up for a really nice vacation or something like that. Having a budget available that strips out everything that's not necessary can really help you find ways to cut back in order to achieve whatever financial goals you're currently working on. So if you don't have an emergency budget in place, maybe go take a look and see, even if you don't complete it fully, even if you just kind of start looking and making a list of some things that you might be able to cut out if the need were to come, it will really make a big difference. And it kind of gives you a better picture of where your money's going. So that's all I have to say today about an emergency budget. I hope this was helpful in some way. Don't forget, you can always email me with any questions or suggestions at lolasfrugallife@gmail.com. You can follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Lola's Frugal Life. And there's a blog post for each episode on my website at lolasfrugallife.com. We also have a private listeners group on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/lolasfrugallife. And if you enjoy the show, please make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen from. And don't forget to screenshot the show and tag me on Instagram so I can see that you're listening. Also, if you could please take a couple of seconds to rate and review the podcast, that would be really helpful to me. Those ratings and reviews are what boost the show in search results so I can continue to try to grow my audience. So that would be really much appreciated. Also, don't forget to check out today's sponsor at shop.analuisa.com/Lola. And there's a link to financially support the podcast in the show notes if that's something you're interested in. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a really awesome day.